I spent 40 years convincing juries that monsters exist in the dark, but I never expected to find two of them sitting at my own dinner table, holding a pen and waiting for me to die. The living room of my Upper East Side brownstone, a space once defined by the sharp, electric hum of strategic brilliance and the comforting scent of expensive vellum, had become a graveyard of my own legacy. Files were stacked like crooked tombstones on every available surface. Dusty depositions from 1994, property deeds from the turn of the century, and the thick, suffocating reams of my own medical records. The light of the late afternoon filtered through the heavy lace curtains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the Persian rug. I sat in my wingback chair, the leather cracked and familiar, my hands gnarled by decades of frantic note-taking, and the cold, unforgiving bite of East Coast winters folded tightly in my lap. I felt every single day of my 68 years. I felt the choking sorrow of a mother who realizes, with the clarity of a closing argument, that she is no longer a person to her children. To them, I had become a series of depreciating assets to be liquidated before the market turned. My son, David, and my daughter Clara stood over the coffee table like vultures circling a fallen stag. David was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than my first 3 years of law school tuition, his eyes darting toward the mahogany grandfather clock I'd inherited from my father. Clara was pacing, her high-end Italian heels clicking against the hardwood with a rhythmic, materialistic impatience that made my head throb. "It's just too much, Mom," Clara said, her voice dripping with an artificial, oily concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Look at this place. It's a hoard. It's a fire hazard. These documents, they're a mess, just like your memory has been lately. You can't even remember where you put your heart medication half the time." "I know where every page is, Clara," I said. My voice was intentionally low, slow, and purposefully fragmented. I let a slight, calculated tremor play in my lower lip. I needed them to see what they wanted to see, a confused old woman sinking into the quicksand of her own mind. David stepped forward, sliding a thick royal blue folder toward me. The gold-embossed seal of a guardianship and transfer of assets agreement caught the light. It looked less like a legal document and more like a death warrant. "Mom, to sign here," David said, his voice dropping into the register of practiced authority he'd surely learned by watching me in court, though he lacked the soul to back it up. "It's for the best. We've already toured the Willows. It's top tier, Mom. 5-star dining, 24-hour medical staff. But we need to manage the property and the accounts to ensure the long-term care is paid for. You're no longer mentally capable of managing the estate. The doctor's report, well, it's not favorable, Mom. It says your cognitive decline is accelerating." He leaned down, his face inches from mine. I could smell the expensive peaty scotch on his breath, a bottle he'd undoubtedly taken from my private cabinet. "Sign the papers, or we'll have to have the state declare you a ward. Do you really want a stranger in a cheap suit deciding which pills you take and when you're allowed to see the sun?" I looked at the pen he held out, a Mont Blanc I had gifted him for his graduation from Harvard Law. The irony was a bitter, metallic pill I swallowed without water. I was at rock bottom, pushed there by the very blood I had spent my youth to protect. I don't know," I stammered, making my eyes wander aimlessly around the room, fixating on a stack of tort law journals from the 80s. The house. It's so quiet. If I leave, who will look after the books? The books are trash, Mom, Clara snapped, her delusions of power finally unmasking her. They're old paper and dust, just like this house. Just stop being difficult for once. You're just a confused old woman now, and you're becoming a burden we can't afford to carry anymore. So this is how they repay me, I thought, the words echoing in the hollow chambers of my heart. Did they really think I had become that senile? I reached out a trembling hand for the pen. My fingers brushed David's, and for a second I felt the coldness of his skin, the coldness of a man who had already buried his mother in his mind. I looked at the blue folder, the punch of the narrative hitting me with full force. They weren't just asking for my signature, they were asking for my soul, my history, and my dignity. If I sign, I whispered, my voice breaking perfectly on cue, will you visit me at the Willows? Every Sunday, Mom, David lied, his voice smooth and transactional. Now, just sign, right there at the X. I looked down at the paper, and I felt the hurt and exhaustion of a 40-year career radiating from my bones. But beneath that, deep in the marrow, the cunning fox I had once been began to stir. They wanted a signature, fine. I would give them exactly what they asked for, but they had forgotten the first rule of litigation. Never assume your opponent is defeated just because they're quiet. I put the pen to the paper, the ink bleeding into the fibers of the contract, and in that moment, the rock bottom became the foundation for the most important case of my life. If this were a legal case, the evidence of intent would be found in the very air of this room. Only by understanding the depths of a betrayal can one truly measure the height of the rise that follows. The blue folder sat on the mahogany coffee table, a stark, clinical rectangular slab that seemed to suck the very light out of the room. It was the punch. The moment the gravity of my children's betrayal shifted from a looming threat to a physical weight on my chest. I stared at the embossed gold lettering of the guardianship and transfer of assets agreement, and for a second, the legal jargon I had spent 40 years masterfully manipulating felt like a foreign language designed specifically to erase me. Mom, sign here. David's voice was a masterpiece of cold luxury, smooth and devoid of any jagged edges of empathy. He nudged the Mont Blanc pen toward me. It rolled across the polished wood with a soft, rhythmic click-clack that sounded like the ticking of a clock, counting down the final seconds of my autonomy. He stood over me, his charcoal gray suit impeccable, his eyes already drifting toward the grandfather clock in the corner. He wasn't looking at his mother. He was inventorying a relic. I don't understand all of this, David, I whispered, my voice intentionally low, slow and purposefully fragmented. I let my hand hover over the paper, a slight, calculated tremor in my fingers. The house, the accounts. I've always managed them since your father passed. I know where every penny is. And that's exactly the problem, Mom, Clara interjected, her high-end heels clicking a sharp, materialistic beat against the hardwood. She didn't even look up from her phone, her thumb flicking through what I could only assume were real estate listings. You think you know, but you're losing time. Last week, you forgot the property tax deadline. The week before, you left the stove on for 3 hours. It's too much. You're a fire hazard waiting to happen. I was distracted, I murmured, playing the role of the confused old woman they so desperately wanted me to be. You're no longer mentally capable of managing the property, Mom, David said, his tone shifting into that disrespectful register of condescension he usually reserved for junior associates who had failed a basic filing. The doctor's report, the one Dr. Aris prepared after your last checkup, is quite clear. Early onset cognitive decline, impaired executive function. You're not just a danger to the house, you're a danger to yourself. He leaned down, placing a hand on the back of my chair, boxing me in. I could smell the expensive, peaty scotch on his breath. Was a bottle he'd undoubtedly helped himself to from my private study. Sign the papers, Mom. If you don't, the court will appoint a public guardian. They'll sell the house at auction, put you in a state-run facility with 3 roommates, and you'll never see a dime of your own money again. Is that what you want? To be a ward of the state? The choking sorrow rose in my throat, a hot, thick silt of memory and betrayal. I looked at Clara, my daughter, the girl I had shielded from every storm, and I saw a stranger. I saw a creditor coming to collect a debt I didn't owe. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if I were a piece of outdated software that was slowing down her life. We've already toured the Willows, she said, her voice dripping with an artificial, oily concern. It's lovely, Mom. They have gardens, and they have bingo. You won't have to worry about a thing. But we need the signature to finalize the entry and the transfer of the brownstone to the trust. It's for your own protection. So this is how they repay me? The thought echoed in the hollow chambers of my heart. Did they really think I had become that senile? I reached out a trembling hand and picked up the pen. The weight of the Mont Blanc, the very one I had gifted David for his graduation from Harvard Law, felt like a lead pipe in my palm. I looked at the X at the bottom of the page. It was a crossroads. If I signed, I was agreeing to my own disappearance. I was consenting to being obsolete. If I sign this, I whispered, my voice breaking perfectly on cue, do I still get to keep my books? The files in the study? The books are dust, Mom, David snapped, his patience finally fraying, revealing the delusions of power beneath the polished exterior. They're old paper. They're trash. Just sign the damn paper so we can get this over with. We have a dinner reservation at 8 o'clock, and I'm not spending all night arguing with a woman who can't remember what day of the week it is. I felt the rock bottom of my existence. I was being evicted from my own life by the people I had built it for. I looked at the blue folder one last time, the punch of the narrative hitting me with full force. They weren't just asking for my property. They were asking for my soul. I put the pen to the vellum. I let the ink bleed into the paper, my signature a shaky, fragmented version of the bold, decisive stroke that had once settled multi-million-dollar tort cases. There, I whispered, and the word barely a breath. As David snatched the folder away, a triumphant materialistic glance passing between him and Clara, I slumped back into my chair. I looked fragmented and exhausted, a woman defeated. But beneath the facade in the marrow of my bones, the cunning fox was wide awake. They had their signature, but they had forgotten the most basic rule of the law. A contract signed under duress is nothing but a confession of the bully's greed. They walked out of the room, their voices already rising in a celebratory discussion of market values and commission rates. I sat in the gathering shadows of my living room, the low, slow pulse of the house beating in time with my own. The humiliation was complete. The punch had landed. Now it was time for the silent observer to begin the counterattack. My kindness was never a doormat, I whispered to the empty room, my voice suddenly losing its tremor and gaining a sharp, lethal edge. It was the laboratory where I planned your exit. The heavy thud of the front door echoed through the brownstone, a final percussive note that signaled the end of my children's visit. The silence that rushed in to fill the void wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. I sat alone in my wingback chair, the leather cool against my skin, staring at the spot on the mahogany coffee table where the blue folder had just been. David had snatched it up with the clinical efficiency of a debt collector, and Clara had followed him out without a backward glance, her heels clicking a celebratory staccato on the sidewalk. I looked at my hand, the one that had just signed away my life. It was shaking. Not the calculated, fragmented tremor I had shown them, but a deep, rhythmic shudder born of a choking sorrow so profound it felt like I was drowning in my own history. I reached for the glass of water they'd left me, but my fingers were too weak to lift it. So this is how they repay me? The thought was a jagged glass shard in my mind. I leaned my head back against the chair and closed my eyes, and suddenly the living room dissolved. I wasn't 68 and confused. I was 30, and the world was a battlefield. I remembered 1988, the year of the Exxon litigation. I remembered the low of the exhaustion that felt like lead in my veins. I was a young mother then, trying to break the glass ceiling with my bare, bleeding hands. I worked 80-hour weeks, fueled by nothing but lukewarm coffee and a primal, hard-working fear that my children would never have enough. I remembered sleeping on a threadbare rug in my office for 3 nights straight, because the 2-hour commute back to the suburbs was time I couldn't afford if I wanted to win that case. I did it for them. Every deposition I sat through, every expert witness I dismantled, every night I missed a bedtime story, it was all a deposit into the quality of their future. I opened my eyes and looked toward the hallway that led to the garage. It was empty now, but in my mind's eye, I saw my 1965 Mustang. It was my only vanity, my only escape. I had spent 3 years restoring that engine myself, my fingernails permanently rimmed with grease, and my heart full of a quiet pride. It was the only thing I had ever bought just for me. But then came 2008. David had landed that prestigious, unpaid internship in D.C., the one he said would open every door to the cold luxury he craved. He didn't have the money for the apartment, the suits, or the lifestyle. I didn't even blink. I sold that car in a single weekend. I traded my only joy for his quality start. I remembered the look on his face when I handed him the check. It wasn't gratitude I saw even then, but a hungry, materialistic expectation. And Clara. I remembered selling my mother's heirloom pearls, the ones I was supposed to wear to my own retirement party, just to pay for her graduation gala and that French immersion camp she simply had to attend. I wanted her to feel like she belonged in the world of power and influence. I didn't want her to see the low, slow struggle of a woman who had to fight for every inch of ground she stood on. And I wanted her to live in the empire I had built from the dirt up. Did they really think I had become that senile? I felt the permanent ache in my lower back, a souvenir from decades of hunched labor over legal briefs and trial transcripts. I had been a cunning fox, a woman feared by the most powerful men in the city, because I could smell a lie from across a crowded courtroom. I had sacrificed my health, my sleep, and the very marrow of my soul to ensure my children would never know the low of the poverty I was raised in. I looked at the grandfather clock. David had been eyeing it for years. To him, it wasn't a family heirloom. It was a high-end asset to be appraised. I saw the way Clara looked at my book collection, not as a lifetime of quiet wisdom, but as a fire hazard that was lowering the resale value of the brownstone. And they didn't see a mother. They saw a burden, a relic, an obsolete piece of hardware that was taking up valuable real estate in their upwardly mobile lives. Their delusions of power had made them blind to the fact that the very platform they stood on was built from my bones. The sorrow in my chest shifted. It was no longer a heavy silt. It was beginning to spark with the cold, strategic intelligence that had once made me the most dangerous woman in the New York Bar Association. They thought they had pushed me to rock bottom. They thought they had stripped me of my dignity with a blue folder and a Mont Blanc pen. They had forgotten the most important rule of the dignity rise. You never, ever underestimate a woman who has spent her life learning how to win when the odds are zero. I reached into the side of my chair, my fingers finding the small, concealed recording device I had installed weeks ago. My hand was no longer trembling. The hurt and exhaustion were still there, but they were now the fuel for a firm, decisive fire. My kindness was never a doormat, I whispered to the empty, shadowed room. It was the laboratory where I planned your exit. You wanted to play the law against me? Fine. Let's see who remembers the statutes better. I had felt the sting of their heartlessness, and I had accounted for every sacrifice they had discarded. Now it was time to reveal the hidden weapon. The fox was no longer mourning the hounds. She was counting the traps. The heavy oak front door clicked shut, the sound echoing through the foyer like a finality I wasn't supposed to understand. I sat perfectly still in my wingback chair, listening to the rhythmic retreat of Clara's heels and the heavy, self-important stride of David as they crossed the sidewalk. A car door slammed. An engine turned over, the purr of a luxury German sedan I had likely subsidized. Then finally, the street returned to the low, humdrum heartbeat of the city. In that silence, the confused old woman evaporated. I straightened my spine, a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a hull being righted after a storm. The fragmented tremor in my hands vanished, replaced by the steady, icy stillness that had once made opposing counsel sweat under their tailored collars. I reached for the glass of water on the coffee table. My grip was iron. I took a sip, the cool liquid sliding down a throat that no longer felt choked by sorrow, but sharpened by the familiar electric tingle of a closing argument. So this is how they repay me? The question didn't hurt anymore. It had become a data point. For 6 months, I had played the role of the relic. I had allowed them to believe the wrinkles on my face were a map of a fading mind, rather than the scars of a veteran who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they truly believe that a woman who had spent 4 decades dismantling the delusions of power of Fortune 500 CEOs, wouldn't notice her own children checking the expiration date on her life. I looked around the living room. They saw a hoard. I saw a filing system. And they saw dust and old paper. I saw the legal truth, 40 years of precedents, favors owed, and records that documented every cent I had poured into their ungrateful lives. I began to recalibrate. This was the strategic intelligence stage. I had spent the last hour as a silent observer, absorbing every micro-expression, every slip of the tongue, and every greedy glance they had cast toward my assets. I knew about Dr. Aris. I had seen the consultancy fee transaction. In a misfiled bank statement, David thought I was too confused to understand. I knew they had already contacted a luxury estate liquidator. I'd found the man's business card tucked into the trash under a pile of Clara's skincare receipts. They weren't just planning a transition. They were planning an erasure. I may be old, I whispered to the shadows of the hallway, my voice no longer a broken reed, but a clear-headed, sharp instrument of war. But I am not foolish, and you've forgotten who built this empire. The dignity rise requires a foundation of absolute, cold-blooded observation. While they were busy gaslighting me into the willows, I was busy mapping their vulnerabilities. David's gambling debts, hidden beneath a veneer of venture capital. Clara's crumbling boutique, propped up by siphoning my private bonds. They thought they were the cunning foxes because they had a blue folder and a corrupt doctor. They forgot that I was the one who taught them how to hunt. I reached into the side of my chair, my fingers finding the small, concealed seam I'd stitched myself. I pulled out a slender, black tablet, my modern hidden asset. I opened the feed. The screen flickered to life, showing 3 different angles of the living room they had just vacated. One camera was tucked into the shadow of the grandfather clock. Another was hidden behind the spine of a first edition constitutional law text. I hit rewind. I watched them again. I watched David's disrespectful smirk when I forgot my middle name. I watched Clara roll her eyes when I asked if I could keep my books. But most importantly, I watched them exchange a triumphant high five the moment I put the pen to the paper. "Checkmate," David had whispered on the recording. I smiled, a thin predatory expression. "Not quite, David. That signature was a performance piece. A signature obtained under documented duress is the cornerstone of a voided contract. Corinne, you just gave me 40 minutes of high-definition evidence." The tone and pacing of the house had changed. It was no longer a warm space filled with the hurt and exhaustion of a mother. It was a war room. Every document in this room was a weapon. Every recording was a nail in the coffin of their greed. I walked toward my study, my gait firm and decisive. I didn't need the cane. I needed my archives. I needed to cross-reference Section 12B of the conditional power of attorney I had drafted in secret 3 months ago, the document that turned their blue folder into a confession. The greatest mistake an antagonist can make is assuming that quiet wisdom is the same thing as silent surrender. We spend our lives building empires for our children, hoping they will be the guardians of our legacy. But if they choose to be scavengers instead, they should remember one thing. A scavenger only wins if the lion is actually dead. I sat at my desk and pulled a fresh yellow legal pad toward me. I uncapped a pen, not the Mont Blanc they had tainted, but a simple, reliable ballpoint. I began to write the first draft of my own closing statement. The clash was coming, and for the first time in 3 years, the cunning fox felt truly alive. They wanted a court at home? Fine. I would give them a trial they would never forget. My kindness was never a doormat, I said, the ink hitting the page with a sharp, rhythmic scratch. It was the laboratory where I planned your exit. Class is in session, children, and the first lesson is the law of consequences. The heavy thud of the front door had long since faded, but the vibration of David's arrogance still seemed to rattle the crystal decanters on the sideboard. I sat in the absolute silence of my brownstone, the fragmented tremor in my hands vanishing as if it had never existed. I straightened my back, a slow, fluid movement that felt like a sword being unsheathed. The choking sorrow was still there, a cold weight in my chest, but it was now overlaid with the familiar electric hum of strategic intelligence. I stood up. I didn't use the mahogany cane. I walked across the Persian rug with the firm, decisive gait of the woman who had once made the New York District Attorney's office tremble. I went to the bookshelf, my fingers trailing over the spines of my life's work until they stopped at the worn leather of Black's Law Dictionary, the 4th edition. I tilted the book. Behind it, nestled in a hollowed-out space, I'd carved myself with a precision that would have made a watchmaker proud, sat a small, blinking digital hub. It was the brain of my hidden weapon. Months ago, when I first heard the predatory edge in Clara's voice, the way she spoke about my decline while eyeing my jewelry, the cunning fox in me had woken up. I knew the materialistic hunger of my children better than they knew themselves. I had seen the delusions of power taking root in David's eyes every time he looked at my deed. So I had called in one last favor. My old clerk, Sarah, a woman who owed me her career and her loyalty, had come over under the guise of helping me organize my files. Together, we had turned this living room into a high-definition recording suite. Behind the eyes of the family portraits, inside the casing of the grandfather clock, and beneath the lip of the mantelpiece, we had installed pinhole cameras and directional microphones. I reached into the hidden compartment and pulled out a slender, encrypted tablet. I tapped the screen. The video feed was crystal clear. There was David leaning over me, his face a mask of disrespectful condescension. There was Clara, her thumb flicking through real estate apps, while I struggled to find my glasses. And there, most importantly, was the audio. "Just sign it, Mom. You're becoming a burden we can't afford to carry. We'll have the movers here by Friday. She won't even remember she lived here in a month." I watched the footage of myself signing that blue folder, the punch they thought had ended the game. I saw the triumphant high five they exchanged the moment I closed the pen. "I may be old," I whispered to the empty room, my voice a sharp, clear-headed alto, "but I am not foolish." But the recording was only the shield. I needed the sword. I walked to my heavy oak desk, the one that overflowed with trash and old paper, according to Clara. I reached into the bottom drawer, triggered a false back, and pulled out a single ivory-colored document. This was the legal truth. 3 months prior, I had drafted a conditional power of attorney. It was a masterpiece of legal trap setting. I had filed it quietly with the county clerk through a secondary firm. Section 12B was my masterpiece. It stated in language so dense and airtight it would take a Supreme Court justice a week to find a flaw, that any subsequent signatures to transfers of property or grants of guardianship obtained from me would be rendered prima facie invalid if they were collected under documented psychological duress, threat of involuntary confinement, or without the presence of an independent court-appointed observer. By pushing me to rock bottom, by threatening me with the cold luxury of the willows to force my signature, they hadn't secured my estate. They had triggered the very clause that would strip them of everything. I had signed their blue folder with a flourish of hurt and exhaustion, but that ink was nothing but a confession of their greed. They had walked out of here thinking they were the hunters. They didn't realize they were already in the cage, and I was the one who held the key. Did they really think I had become that senile? I asked the shadows, and I sat back down in my chair, the quiet wisdom of my years settling around me like a protective cloak. I felt a pang of self-sacrificing grief, the realization that I was using my greatest skills not to protect my children, but to protect myself from them. It was a low I never thought I'd reach, but as a mother I had given them every tool to succeed. As a lawyer, I would now give them the only thing they had truly earned, a lesson in the law of consequences. I looked at the blue folder's ghost on the table. The turning point had passed. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was the opposing counsel. My kindness was never a doormat, I said, my voice gaining its final, decisive weight. It was the laboratory where I planned your exit. You wanted a court at home? You've got one. And the fox is back on the bench. I tapped the tablet, sending the encrypted files to Sarah. The clash was coming, and for the first time in years, the air in the brownstone didn't feel heavy with dust. It felt electric. The greatest weapon is never the one your enemy sees you carrying. It is the one they don't believe you are capable of using. We spend our lives building empires for our children, but we must never forget to build a fortress for our own dignity. Loyalty is earned, but the law is written. And when the people you love try to use your heart as a weapon against you, make sure your mind is already 10 steps ahead of them. The heavy soundproof doors of the willows closed with a soft, expensive hiss, sealing out the sounds of the city, and with them, the last 68 years of my life. The foyer was a masterpiece of cold luxury, soaring ceilings, minimalist glass art, and a scent of artificial lavender that failed to mask the sterile, clinical odor of a place where people go to be forgotten in comfort. Clara stood by the reception desk, her thumb flicking across her phone with a rhythmic, materialistic indifference. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at the small, battered suitcase, the trash she'd packed for me, sitting on the polished white marble floor. "You'll love the view, Mom," she said, her voice dropping into that oily, practiced trill of performative concern. She finally looked up, her eyes skimming over my face, as if I were a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit the new decor. "It's top tier, 5-star dining, 24-hour wellness checks. You won't have to worry about a thing. David and I have handled everything." I sat in the wheelchair they had insisted I use, my hands folded in my lap. I let my head tilt slightly to the side, my eyes wide and fragmented, unfocused on the gleaming surfaces. I felt the choking sorrow of the exile, a hot, thick silt of betrayal that made every breath feel like a labor. So this is how they repay me? The contrast of sacrifice. As the orderly began to wheel me toward the memory care wing, a wing with locked doors and keypad codes, my mind drifted back to the heat of 1988. I remembered the low of the exhaustion during the Exxon litigation. I was 35 then, and a cunning fox in a skirt suit, fighting a room full of men who thought they could drown me in paperwork. I remembered working 80-hour weeks, my eyes burning under the flickering fluorescent lights of the office, fueled by nothing but cold coffee and a primal hard-working drive to ensure my children never knew the low of the poverty that had haunted my own youth. I remembered the nights I spent sleeping on the office floor, the rough carpet against my cheek, because the commute back to the suburbs was time I couldn't afford if I wanted to win the case that bought their first trust funds. I looked at Clara's back as she walked ahead of us, her heels clicking a sharp, disrespectful beat. I remembered selling my 1965 Mustang, the only thing I ever truly loved that didn't have a heartbeat. I'd spent 3 years restoring that engine, my fingernails rimmed with grease and my heart full of a quiet, independent pride. But David needed the tuition for that prestigious D.C. internship, the one that gave him the delusions of power he now wielded like a club. I didn't hesitate. I traded my only luxury for his quality start. And Clara. I remembered selling my mother's heirloom pearls, the ones I was supposed to wear to my own retirement party, just to pay for her graduation gala, and that French immersion camp she simply had to attend. I wanted her to feel like she belonged in the world of power. I didn't want her to see the low, slow struggle of the woman who built the platform she stood on. Did they really think I had become that senile? The sterile cell. We reached room 402. It was a warm space in name only. The walls were a soft, unthreatening beige. The furniture was rounded to prevent injury. The windows were triple paned to dampen the sound of a world I was no longer allowed to inhabit. "There you go," Clara said, dropping my suitcase on the bed. She checked her gold watch, the one I'd given her for her 30th birthday. "I have a meeting with the real estate agent at 4. We need to get the brownstone listed while the market is peak. Don't worry about the books, Mom. We're donating most of them. They're just dust magnets now." "The books," I whispered, my voice low and slow, a fragmented echo of my former self. "The files, the 1994 depositions." "They're trash, Mom," she snapped, her patience finally evaporating. She leaned down, her face a mask of disrespectful pity. "You're just a confused old woman who's lived too long in her own head. Relax. Let the nurses take care of you. You're obsolete now. Just let go." She kissed my cheek, a cold transactional peck, and walked out. I heard the keypad beep, the lock engaged, the low and the spark. I sat on the edge of the bed, the spatial contrast between my book-filled, mahogany-scented home and this clinical cage threatening to break the very center of my soul. I felt the isolation. I felt the loneliness. I felt the hurt and exhaustion of 40 years of motherhood and lawyering being summed up as a fire hazard. But as the shadows lengthened in the room, the fragmented look in my eyes began to sharpen. The choking sorrow didn't disappear, but it found a container. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and felt the small, cold edge of the digital recorder Sarah had smuggled into my trash suitcase. My hand was no longer trembling. The low had been reached, but beneath the silt of their betrayal, The cunning fox was wide awake. My kindness was never a doormat, I whispered to the sterile beige walls. My voice was no longer low. It was clear-headed and sharp. It was the laboratory where I planned your exit. They had their signature. They had the brownstone. They had the delusions of power. But they had forgotten the most important rule of the courtroom. Never underestimate an opponent who has nothing left to lose but her dignity. The world will try to tell you that your value is written in the smoothness of your skin or the speed of your stride. They will treat your quiet wisdom as a weakness and your age as an expiration date. But truth has a way of hiding in the textures. But the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with the loudest voice. It's the one who knows how to listen while they're being discarded. The nursing home exile was not my ending. It was my prep time. The clash was coming, and I was going to ensure that when the gavel finally fell, the only thing obsolete in the room would be my children's greed. I lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. I wasn't sleeping. I was rehearsing. And the quality of my closing argument was going to be flawless. The Willows is a place where time goes to die in soft beige increments. The air is perpetually heavy with the scent of industrial-strength lemon polish, and the muted, desperate hope of people who have been told their stories are finished. To the staff, I was just Elena in 402, a quiet woman who stared at the gardens with a fragmented gaze. They saw a relic whose only utility was to occupy a bed and be grateful for the pudding. But beneath the hurt and exhaustion of the first few weeks, the gathering storm was forming. My mind, once a sharp instrument of the New York bar, was no longer mourning the loss of my home. It was performing a slow, methodical discovery of my children's crimes. Every morning, I practiced my clear-headed, sharp mental exercises to sharpening the strategic intelligence that had once dismantled corporate conglomerates. So this is how they repay me, I thought, as a nurse patted my hand with a condescending sweetness before checking the locks on my door. Did they really think I had become that senile? The catalyst for the storm's break came on a Tuesday. Sarah, my former clerk, arrived under the guise of a charity volunteer from the local parish. She wore a simple floral dress and carried a bag of knitting supplies. But tucked beneath the wool was the slender, black tablet containing the harvest of my hidden cameras. We sat in the sunroom, a warm space that felt like a glass cage. The other residents were slumped in their chairs, lost in the fog of their own low periods. But Sarah and I were in a war room. "They've listed the brownstone." "Annalena," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and professional indignation. She slid the tablet toward me, hiding it under a half-finished scarf. "David contacted an auction house for the library. He called the books paperweight trash. Clara has already moved half of your jewelry to a safe deposit box in her name." I watched the screen. The footage was visceral. I saw David sitting in my wingback chair, my father's chair, sipping my vintage port and laughing about the consultancy fee he'd paid to Dr. Aries to forge my cognitive decline report. I saw Clara walking through my study, dragging a garbage bag, tossing 40 years of my legal life, my cases, my notes, my quiet wisdom into the trash like it was nothing but clutter. "Look at them, Sarah," I said, my voice no longer low or slow. It was the firm, a decisive voice of a lead litigator. They aren't just scavengers, they're amateurs. They think the blue folder is the end of the story because they've never stood on the other side of a hidden asset. I felt the choking sorrow rise again, but this time it didn't weigh me down. It became the propellant. I remembered the self-sacrificing years I spent building their cold luxury. I remembered the hard-working nights I spent in the basement of that very brownstone, crafting the trust that was supposed to protect them, only to have them use it as a weapon against me. "The hearing is on Friday," Sarah said, her eyes meeting mine. "David is petitioning for permanent irrevocable guardianship. He's brought in a high-priced firm to handle the liquidation of your remaining assets. They're going for a total erasure, Elena." "An erasure is only possible if the subject is truly gone," I replied, a thin, predatory smile touching my lips. "They've forgotten that I drafted the original trust. They've forgotten about Section 12B, and they've certainly forgotten that I kept the digital keys to the surveillance server." We spent the next 2 hours in a fever of strategic intelligence. We compiled the recordings, the threats, the laughter, the admissions of forgery. We cross-referenced the dates of the signatures with the timestamps on the duress footage. Every piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of their greed. As Sarah gathered her things to leave, I felt the low of my exhaustion being replaced by the electric hum of the gathering storm. I wasn't just a mother in a nursing home anymore. I was a woman preparing her final closing argument. "I may be old," I whispered to Sarah as she stood to leave, "but I am the one who built this empire. And on Friday, I am going to show them that a relic still knows how to command a courtroom." Sarah squeezed my hand. "They won't know what hit them." "They'll know," I said. "It will be the sound of 40 years of justice finally coming home." We spend our lives teaching our children how to speak, but we often fail to teach them how to listen to the silence of their elders. We assume that because a person has reached the low of their years, they have lost the quality of their mind. But a storm is most dangerous just before it breaks. Never mistake a mother's patience for a lack of a plan. The most powerful hidden asset isn't money or property. It's the truth, saved for the moment when the opponent is most arrogant. I watched the sun set over the gardens of the willows. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't feel thin. It felt heavy with the scent of an impending reckoning. The clash was coming, and the cunning fox was ready to step out of the shadows and back into the light of the law. "My kindness was never a doormat," I said to the darkening room. "It was the laboratory where I planned your exit." The 5 a.m. light at the willows was not the soft amber glow of a morning in my brownstone. It was a thin, clinical blue that made the sterile walls look like frozen milk. I sat on the edge of the twin bed, my feet touching the cold linoleum. My back ached, the familiar heavy pull of 40 years of bending over case files. But as I stood up, I didn't reach for the plastic walker the nurses had insisted I use. I stood straight. I felt the strategic intelligence of my youth rising like a tide, washing away the fragmented fog I had so carefully cultivated as a mask. Today was the return to the bench, not as a judge and not as a partner, but as the primary witness in the trial for my own life. I walked to the small laminate wardrobe, tucked behind the drab, floral house dresses Clara had bought to make me look harmless, was a garment bag Sarah had smuggled in 2 days ago. I unzipped it. The scent of cedar and high-end wool filled the small room, a warm space of memory in this cold luxury prison. It was my favorite charcoal gray power suit, the one I'd worn in 2002 when I dismantled the legal defense of a tobacco giant in front of a stunned jury. So this is how they repay me, I thought as I ran my fingers over the silk lining. Did they really think I had become that senile? Did they truly believe that the cunning fox who had outmaneuvered the brightest legal minds in the country had been replaced by a woman who couldn't remember her own worth? They saw the wrinkles and the low, slow gait and assumed the engine had stopped running. And they forgot that the most dangerous shark in the ocean is the one you don't see until the water turns red. A soft knock came at the door. It was Nurse Miller, a young woman with a voice like saccharine who insisted on calling me Sweetie. "Good morning, Elena, sweetie," she chirped, her eyes not leaving her clipboard. "It's a big day. Your children are coming to take you to a special meeting. Let's get you into your pretty blue sweater, shall we?" I turned slowly. I didn't use the fragmented voice of a confused mother. I used the clear-headed, sharp tone of a senior partner. "I won't be wearing the sweater, Nurse Miller," I said. The girl looked up, her jaw dropping as she saw me standing there, perfectly poised, holding the charcoal blazer. And the spatial contrast was absolute. I looked like I belonged in the boardroom of a multinational corporation, not in a supervised memory care wing. Oh my," she stammered, her patronizing mask slipping. You look very professional." "I am professional," I replied, my voice gaining its firm, decisive weight. "And today I am going to remind everyone in that courthouse exactly what that means." I put on the blazer. The weight of it was like armor. I checked the hidden pocket inside the lining. There it was, a small silver thumb drive containing the harvest of my hidden weapon, the recordings of David and Clara's greed. Beside it lay the ivory-colored copy of my conditional power of attorney. These were my tangible assets. Sarah arrived shortly after, dressed as a clerical assistant to help with my transport. We walked through the lobby of the Willows. I didn't shuffle. I walked with the rhythmic, commanding stride of a woman who is reclaiming her territory. I saw the facility manager watch me pass, his eyes wide with a sudden, panicked realization that he might have helped imprison a lion. "I may be old, Sarah," I whispered as we stepped into the crisp morning air, "but I am not foolish." "You look like a nightmare in silk, Elena," Sarah replied with a grin. "And David and Clara are about to have the worst day of their lives." As we drove toward the courthouse, I watched the city fly by. I saw the cold luxury of the high-rise offices and the materialistic blur of the morning commute. I thought about the hard-working years I spent in those buildings, the self-sacrificing nights I gave up, so my children could have everything they never earned. I felt a choking sorrow for the mother I used to be, but it was quickly replaced by the strategic intelligence of the lawyer I had become again. "You've forgotten who built this empire," I said to the distant skyline. I looked at my hands. They were steady. The low of my exile was over. The clash was only minutes away. We spend our lives teaching our children that the world is a game of quantity. More money, more status, more power. But the law, like life, is a game of quality. It's the quality of your evidence, the quality of your character, and the quality of the silence you maintain while your opponent underestimates you. Never mistake a person's age for their absence. And a mind that has spent decades in the quiet wisdom of the law doesn't fade. It simply waits for the right moment to strike. I adjusted my lapels as the courthouse came into view. The granite steps, the pillars, the scales of justice. To David and Clara, this was the place where they would finally dispose of their burden. To me, it was the arena where I would prove that my kindness was never a doormat. My kindness, I whispered the words like a vow, was the laboratory where I planned your exit. I stepped out of the car. The return to the bench had begun, and the fox was hungry. The same mahogany-paneled courtroom where I once secured the futures of 1,000 families was now the arena where my own children intended to strip me of my name, my home, and my very identity. The air in courtroom 4B was thick with the scent of floor wax and the cold, sterile weight of institutional authority. I sat at the respondent's table, my back pressed against the hard oak chair. I felt the choking sorrow of the last few months settle into a cold, hard knot of strategic intelligence in the pit of my stomach. To my right sat Sarah, my faithful clerk, her hands steady as she organized the folders that would soon become our bayonets. Across the aisle, David and Clara sat with their high-priced legal team, men in three-piece suits, who looked at me with the same clinical detachment one might afford a piece of evidence. David was leaning back, a look of materialistic triumph already etched into his features. He smoothed his silk tie, another gift from me, with a hand that had never known the hard-working calluses of the life I'd led. Clara sat beside him, her spine rigid with delusions of power, her eyes fixed on the judge's bench, as if she were already mentally measuring the drapes for my brownstone. So this is how they repay me, I thought, watching them whisper to their lead counsel. Did they really think I had become that senile? The heavy doors at the back of the room swung open, and the bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the gallery. All rise. Judge Miller, a man whose reputation for fairness was as gray and weathered as his hair, took the bench. He looked down at the petitions, then at me. His eyes were filled with a visible, soul-crushing pity, the kind of pity reserved for a relic who has outlived her usefulness. It was the same look David had used to gaslight me in my own living room. "We are here today," Judge Miller began, his voice echoing in the hallowed hall, "to determine the permanent, irrevocable guardianship of Mrs. Elena Sterling. The petitioners argue that due to significant cognitive decline, Mrs. Sterling is no longer capable of managing her person or her substantial estate." David's lawyer stood up, his voice a smooth, oily trill of performative concern. "Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming. We have the report from Dr. Aris, multiple instances of documented confusion, and a signed transfer of assets agreement from the respondent herself. It is a tragedy, but for her own safety, she must be placed under the protection of her children." I felt the low of the moment, the sheer, staggering weight of their betrayal. They had built a cage out of my own signature. They had turned my self-sacrificing love into a weapon of my own destruction. I looked at David. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was already looking past me, toward the cold luxury of the life my absence would fund. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Miller said, his tone softening to that of a man speaking to a child, Your counsel has indicated you wish to speak. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings? Do you have anything to say before I rule?" A hush fell over the room. David leaned forward, a disrespectful smirk playing on his lips, waiting for the fragmented stammering of a confused old woman. Clara adjusted her pearls, her face a mask of bored quality control. I didn't reach for my cane. I didn't tremble. I stood up. The movement was slow, fluid, and filled with the firm, decisive grace of the cunning fox I had always been. I straightened my charcoal gray blazer, the silk lining cool against my skin, and walked toward the podium. The spatial contrast was immediate. I wasn't a resident of room 402 at the Willows anymore. I was a senior litigation partner reclaiming her bench. "I do, Your Honor," I said. My voice didn't crack. It didn't whisper. It was clear-headed, sharp, and resonated with the authority of 40 years in the well of the court. I saw the smirk vanish from David's face. I saw Clara's hand go to her throat. "I find it interesting, Your Honor," I continued, my eyes locking onto David's with a lethal intensity, "that my children speak of my safety while they negotiate the liquidation of my library. They speak of my confusion while they use my private bonds to settle gambling debts they believe are hidden beneath a veneer of venture capital." "Objection!" David's lawyer barked, but Judge Miller raised a hand, his eyes now narrowed, fixed on me with a sudden dawning recognition. "You've forgotten who built this empire," I said, turning my gaze to the gallery where my children sat frozen. "You thought the wrinkles on my face were a map of a fading mind. You forgot they are the scars of a veteran who never lost a case in this room. You thought you could push me to rock bottom, and I would simply stay there." I leaned against the podium, my hands steady as stone. "My kindness was never a doormat, David. And it was the laboratory where I planned your exit. And today I am moving for a discovery that will show this court exactly who in this room is truly mentally incapable of basic human decency, incapable of legal integrity, and incapable of realizing that their mother is the most dangerous person they will ever cross." The clash had begun. The cunning fox was no longer hiding in the shadows of a nursing home. I was back in the light, and the day of judgment was going to be a master class in the law of consequences. The world will try to convince you that your age is a cage, that your quiet wisdom is just a polite term for obsolescence. They will try to use your heart as a door to your house, and once they're inside, they'll try to change the locks. But remember this: the person who built the house always knows where the trapdoors are. Never let the low of a moment make you forget the quality of your life. The truth doesn't need a cane to stand on. It only needs a voice that refuses to be silenced. I looked at the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to move for the immediate introduction of hidden assets into this record." The storm had broken, and I was the thunder. The courtroom was a cathedral of high ceilings and hushed whispers, but for me, it had become a laboratory. I stood at the podium, my charcoal gray blazer feeling like a second skin, a suit of armor I hadn't worn in years, but which still fit with a terrifying, tailored precision. Behind me, the gallery was a blur of spectators. In front of me, Judge Miller sat like an ancient statue, his eyes no longer filled with pity, but with a dawning, sharp curiosity. David and Clara sat at the petitioner's table, their materialistic confidence beginning to fray at the edges. David was tapping a rhythmic, nervous beat on the mahogany table with the Mont Blanc pen, my pen, while Clara's hand was frozen at her throat, clutching the pearls I had sold my soul to buy her. They were waiting for the fragmented mother to reappear, and the one who couldn't remember where she'd put her keys. Instead, they were staring into the barrel of the cunning fox. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear-headed and sharp, slicing through the stagnant air of the room. "The petitioners have presented a blue folder, a transfer of assets agreement, as the cornerstone of their claim. They argue it is proof of my consent. I argue it is a piece of evidence in a crime." David's lawyer, a man who looked like he spent more on his hair than his education, jumped to his feet. "Objection, this is inflammatory. The document is signed and witnessed." "It is indeed signed," I said, turning my head slowly to look David in the eye. I didn't see my son. I saw a defendant. But a signature is a meeting of minds, and there can be no meeting of minds where one party is holding a figurative gun to the other's head. I reached into the folder Sarah had handed me and pulled out the ivory-colored document, the legal truth. "This, Your Honor, is a conditional power of attorney I drafted and filed 3 months ago. Under Section 12. B, a clause I designed specifically for the protection of elders against materialistic coercion. Any subsequent grants of guardianship are rendered prima facie invalid if obtained under documented duress, and I am here to document the duress." I saw the turning point in the judge's expression. He leaned forward, the spatial contrast shifting, as he realized the power dynamic in the room had fundamentally flipped. "Proceed, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice a low rumble. I signaled to Sarah, who hit play on the digital interface of the court. The 30-foot screen behind the judge's bench flickered to life. The image was grainy but unmistakable. My living room 3 months ago. The audio, captured by the hidden asset in the grandfather clock, erupted through the high-fidelity speakers. "Sign the papers, Mom, or we'll have the state declare you a ward. Do you really want a stranger in a cheap suit deciding which pills you take?" That was David's voice. The cold luxury of his arrogance was now broadcast to the world. The courtroom was deathly silent, save for the sound of Clara's frantic breathing. Then came the punch of the recording. "The books are trash, Mom. Just stop being difficult. You're just a confused old woman now, and you're a burden we can't afford to carry." I watched David's face on the screen, and then I looked at the man sitting 3 feet away. The choking sorrow I had felt in the nursing home was gone, replaced by the clinical, strategic intelligence of the artist finishing her masterpiece. "Is that the voice of filial concern, Your Honor?" I asked. My tone as cold and firm as the marble beneath my feet. Or is it the voice of 2 people using a mother's self-sacrificing history as a roadmap to her bank accounts? "Mom, stop!" Clara shrieked from the table, her delusions of power dissolving into a messy public panic. "This is private. You're hurting us." "I am not hurting you, Clara," I replied, my voice gaining a final, decisive weight. "I am simply cross-examining the blood I gave you. You wanted a court at home. You wanted to use the law as a blade to cut me out of my own life. But you forgot that I am the one who taught you how to speak, and I am the one who will teach you how to listen to the truth." I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, the recordings also include evidence of the consultancy fee paid to Dr. Aras to forge my cognitive decline report. My low was a fabrication. My fragmentation was a strategy. And their greed is a matter of public record. The clash reached its crescendo as David tried to stand, his face a mask of a too-late apology. But the bailiff stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. The spatial contrast was absolute. My children were no longer the owners of my legacy. They were the architects of their own shame. "You've forgotten who built this empire," I whispered, though the words carried to every corner of the room. The tragedy of the digital age is that we believe we can curate a soul as easily as we curate a feed. We think that by hiding the wrinkles and the relics, we can escape the weight of our own actions. But character is not a filter. It is the raw, unedited footage of our lives. When you treat the foundation of your success like a doormat, do not be surprised when the very walls you built to protect your vanity become the screen that broadcasts your shame. My kindness was the laboratory where I planned your exit, and tonight the world is watching the results. I sat back down. My hands were perfectly steady. The high of the justice I was reclaiming was intoxicating, but the low of the son I had lost was a ghost I would have to live with. I looked at the judge. The consequence was inevitable. "The defense rests." "Your Honor," I said. "And the mother?" "The mother is finally at peace." The evidence of a person's life isn't found in the deeds they sign, but in the echoes of the words they speak when they think no one is listening. I had spent 40 years recording the truth. Today, I simply hit play. The silence that followed the final playback of the recordings was not the peaceful quiet of a resolved conflict. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness of a vacuum. In the hallowed well of courtroom 4B, the air seemed to vibrate with the sheer quality of the truth I had just unleashed. I stood at the podium, my hands resting lightly on the polished oak, feeling the rhythmic thrum of my own heart, no longer the frantic, fragmented beat of a victim, but the steady, heavy pulse of a victor. I looked at Judge Miller. The pity that had once clouded his features was gone, replaced by a cold, incandescent fury that mirrored my own. He wasn't looking at a relic anymore. He was looking at a peer who had been desecrated. "I have seen enough," the judge said, his voice a low, a tectonic rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cold luxury my children had tried to build on my grave. He turned his gaze toward the petitioner's table. David was slumped in his chair, the Mont Blanc pen, my pen, lying forgotten on the floor. He looked small. For all his materialistic suits and delusions of power, he looked like a child caught in a lie he wasn't smart enough to sustain. Clara was weeping, but there was no choking sorrow in her tears. They were the jagged, frantic sobs of a predator who had realized the cage doors were now locking from the outside. "In 30 years on this bench," Judge Miller began, "I have witnessed the many ways in which greed can erode the human soul. But rarely have I seen a betrayal so calculated, so disrespectful, and so utterly devoid of the basic quality of character we expect from the officers of this court and the members of a family." He picked up the ivory-colored document, my conditional power of attorney. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, looking at me with a nod of profound respect, "your legal craftsmanship remains as airtight as it was the day you argued the Exxon case. Under the authority of Section 12B and in light of the hidden asset evidence presented today, I am hereby declaring the transfer of assets agreement and the petition for guardianship void, ab initio, void from the beginning. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, but I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the scales of justice behind the bench. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice gaining a firm, decisive weight, and this court finds the petitioners, David and Clara Sterling, in contempt of the fundamental principles of equity. I am stripping them of any and all legal standing regarding the respondent's estate. Effective immediately, the temporary guardianship is terminated. Mrs. Sterling, you are restored to the full, unencumbered control of your person, your home, and your assets. The spatial contrast in that moment was breathtaking. David and Clara, who had walked into this room as the architects of my exit, were now the ones being erased from the narrative of my life. But the law does not stop at restoration, Judge Miller said, his eyes narrowing as he looked back at my children. There is the matter of the low you forced upon this woman, the emotional battery of being gaslit in her own home and exiled to a facility under false pretenses. I am ordering the petitioners to pay the respondent a sum of $750,000 in compensatory damages for emotional distress and the legal costs incurred in this defense. The quantity they had worshipped was now being stripped from them to pay for the quality they had tried to destroy. David let out a hollow, broken sound, the sound of a materialistic dream finally hitting the concrete. I am also referring the matter of Dr. Aris to the State Medical Board for the immediate revocation of his license, the judge added, the final nail in the coffin of their conspiracy. This court is adjourned. The gavel hit the block with a sharp, echoing crack, the final punch of the story. I didn't move. I stood there as the room erupted into motion, watching David and Clara being led away by their now silent legal team. They didn't look back. They couldn't. I felt a fleeting, self-sacrificing pang for the children I had raised, but it was quickly replaced by a profound, clear-headed peace. So this is how I reclaim myself, I whispered to the empty air of the podium. I felt the ache in my joints, the hard-working scars of a lifetime of labor, but they didn't feel like a burden anymore. They felt like a map of a territory I had successfully defended. The dignity rise was complete. I was no longer a relic in room 402. I was Elena Sterling, the woman who had built an empire and proved she was the only one capable of ruling it. We spend our lives building empires for our children, hoping they will be the guardians of our legacy. But we must never forget that the law is not a substitute for character, and quantity is not a substitute for quality. When the people you love try to use your heart as a weapon against you, remember that the legal truth is a shield, but your dignity is the sword. Never be afraid to use the strategic intelligence of your years to defend the quiet wisdom of your soul. I looked at Sarah, who was smiling through tears of her own. We gathered our files, the trash and old paper that had saved my life, and prepared to leave the courtroom. I didn't need the walker. I didn't need the cane. I walked out of that room with the firm, decisive stride of a woman who was finally going home. The clash was over, and the conclusion was written, and the cunning fox had finally found her peace. I watched the auctioneer's gavel fall on the last of my children's pride, realizing that the most expensive thing they ever tried to buy was the mother they assumed was too broken to fight back. The heavy bronze doors of the courthouse swung shut behind me, the sound echoing like a final, authoritative period at the end of a long, tortuous sentence. I stood on the granite steps, the crisp New York air filling my lungs with a clarity I hadn't felt since I first smelled the scent of old vellum and ink 40 years ago. Beside me, Sarah clutched the final court order, the legal truth, as if it were a holy relic. Across the plaza, I saw David and Clara. They weren't walking. They were retreating. David's charcoal suit, once a symbol of his delusions of power, looked wrinkled and cheap in the harsh afternoon sun. Clara was leaning against a pillar, her face a smeared mask of materialistic defeat. They had walked into that courtroom as the architects of my exit, and they were leaving it as the ruins of their own greed. So this is how they repay me, I thought, looking at the distant, retreating figures of my own flesh and blood. Did they really think I had become that senile? The judge's ruling hadn't just been a legal victory. It was a surgical removal of their influence from my life. He hadn't just stripped them of their guardianship. He had stripped them of their masks. The order was absolute. The brownstone was restored to my name. The transfer of assets was voided as a product of documented duress. And the most delicious irony of all, they were ordered to pay me $750,000 in compensatory damages for emotional distress. It was the ultimate consequence. The quantity they had worshipped, the equity in my home, and the bonds in my safe was now being siphoned away to pay for the quality of the life they had tried to destroy. The return to the sanctuary. I returned to my brownstone that evening, but I didn't enter through the service entrance. I walked up the front steps, my gait firm and decisive. I didn't need the mahogany cane. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the foyer. The spatial contrast was staggering. For months, this house had felt like a hunting ground. Now it felt like a sanctuary again. I walked through the living room, past the stacks of trash and old paper that had served as the laboratory for my counterattack. I ran my hand over the leather spines of my law books. They weren't fire hazards anymore. They were the silent sentinels of my quiet wisdom. I went to the sideboard and poured a glass of my vintage port, the same bottle David had toasted his victory with weeks ago. I took a sip, the dark, peaty warmth sliding down my throat, washing away the last of the choking sorrow. I looked into the mahogany-framed mirror in the hallway. I didn't see the fragmented old woman they had tried to bury in room 402 of the Willows. I saw the cunning fox. The wrinkles were still there, but they were no longer a map of my decline. They were the tactical lines of a veteran who had won her final and most personal war. The final closing argument. As the shadows of the city lengthened against the walls of my study, I sat at my desk and opened a fresh yellow legal pad. I wasn't drafting a brief. I was writing the final entry in the ledger of my motherhood. Justice, I realized, is not just something we seek in marble buildings with high ceilings. It is the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a life lived with integrity. We spend our lives building empires for our children, hoping they will be the guardians of our legacy. But we must never forget that a person who values quantity over quality will eventually try to liquidate the very foundation they stand on. David and Clara had forgotten the first rule of litigation. Never assume your opponent is defeated just because they are quiet. They had looked at my age and seen a weakness. They should have looked at my age and seen a curriculum. I reached for the Mont Blanc pen, the one Sarah had recovered from the courtroom floor, and set it aside. I picked up my old, reliable ballpoint. The luxury was their obsession. The utility was mine. My kindness, I whispered to the quiet room, was never a doormat. It was the laboratory where I planned your exit. Philosophical life lessons. The dignity rise is not a single event. It is a choice we make every morning to remember our own worth. To anyone standing at the rock bottom of their own life, pushed there by the people they once trusted, remember these 3 truths from the cunning fox. Silence is a strategic asset. Let them believe you are fragmented. Let them believe you are obsolete. Their arrogance is your greatest hidden weapon. An enemy who underestimates you has already handed you the keys to their defeat. The law of quality. A life is measured not by the quantity of assets you accumulate, but by the quality of the truth you maintain. Greed is a corrosive agent. It will eventually eat through the strongest materialistic mask. Dignity is non-negotiable. They can take your home, and they can try to take your time, but they can only take your dignity if you sign the paper. Never sign the paper. I finished my port and looked at the grandfather clock. It ticked with a steady, authoritative rhythm, marking the time of a woman who was finally and fully home. The clash was over. The conclusion was written. And for the first time in 68 years, the only person I had to defend was the woman in the mirror. She was doing just fine. The court is in permanent session, I said, turning out the light, and the mother is finally at peace.